we're going to get started. We have a lot we want to cover in this session, and I suspect some people that have been attending other sessions in our summit may already know what's coming next and may feel at ease in joining a bit late. So let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. It's great to have you with us. We would like to run a quick poll just to get things started. That should be appearing on your screen momentarily. And it would be great if you could, there it is, I see it. If you could just give us an answer to that. And while you're looking at that, I'm going to carry on and do just a bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded, so you don't need to worry about that. And we will make the recording available after the session, not immediately after the session, probably next week. We'll send a follow-up email to everyone that's registered to share the recording, and it will also be available on our website. Please note that we are in webinar mode for this session, and that means our attendees will be muted and unable to turn on cameras for the duration. However, as in all our other sessions, we're still really keen to hear from you, and there are two ways for that to happen. Firstly, while we don't have a specifically sort of dedicated Q&A session planned for this, our fantastic speakers are going to have a fireside chat, and they may well be informed by the questions that you put into the Q&A box. So do please feel free to do that. Any questions you might like our panelists to address in the Q&A box, also please keep an eye on the Q&A box, because if there's a question there that you're particularly keen to have us address, you can give it an upvote by clicking on the thumbs up symbol, and that will make it easier for Jessica to identify the top questions and make sure that that gets discussed. If you just want to comment or you want to share your LinkedIn profile or just how the weather is where you are, that's great, and please do that in the chat. If you're having any technical difficulties, that's also the place to bring them to our attention. So comments in the chat, questions in the Q&A. Don't forget to vote for the questions you like, and we're going to be just fine. We've turned on the automatic closed captioning, the transcript for this session. You should have a button at the bottom of your screen that allows you to turn that on. If you are going to use that, do please bear in mind that the transcription is automatic, produced by Zoom, and we don't have any control over it. And so we will apologize for any typos or mistakes, but as I said, there's nothing we can do about it. And finally, we're very happy for you to talk about anything you hear in this session on Twitter and or LinkedIn, and we have a hashtag to bring all of that conversation together, hashtag CA Summit 2022. There it is in the chat. It would be great if you could tag us and use that hashtag on any tweets or posts that you might like to put out there. Just gonna check in with the team how we're doing on that poll. Do we want to leave it live for another minute or so, or we're gonna make it go now? Let's see the results. So, oh, very interesting indeed. Very nice to see such a large proportion of our audience already investing in nature, and not an insignificant number that don't know yet, or that it's not applicable. Interesting that people think it's not applicable. So there's some good fodder for our speakers to contemplate later on in the session. Okay, let's just continue with that housekeeping. Let's go on to the next slide. And just for those of you that have not attended any of the other sessions in the summit, just a really brief introduction to the UN Global Compact. We are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We've got over 17,000 companies and another 4,000 non-business organizations that have made a commitment to our 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. These principles are drawn from UN treaties, so they are truly universal, and they provide a really robust foundation for any corporate sustainability program. We have local networks in 70 countries around the world, including the UK. And our role is to deliver a program of events to support our participating companies to be more sustainable. And we organize over 100 events a year to that end. Really easy to join, a CEO commitment. There are links in the chat where you can learn more about how to do that and learn more about the Global Compact Network. Do please get in touch if you're interested in learning more about that. Okay, and so this is our Climate Action Summit, and today we are focusing on how we can support business to implement practical and effective solutions to reach net zero and build further business, societal, and environmental resilience. Let's go on to the next slide. And just to say that this is our final session, exploring specifically nature-themed topics. And we're really looking forward to an interesting discussion about how and why business should be investing in nature and how this can increase business resilience. And I'm really delighted to welcome three fantastic experts on our panel today. First up, Jessica Smith, Nature Lead at the UNEP Finance Initiative, and Greta Talbot-Jones, Associate Director at Responsible Investment at Aviva Investors. And lastly, Cécile Girardin, Director at Nature-Based Insetting, Technical Director at Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, and the Science Lead at the University of Oxford Biodiversity Network. Now, the program for today, for this session, Jessica is going to get us started with a keynote that's going to lay some groundwork for the conversation, and then she'll be joined by Greta and Cécile, and they're going to have an informal fireside chat that we all get to eavesdrop on. But if you do put questions into the Q&A box, then they will certainly be keeping an eye on that, and hopefully we'll be able to get to some of those. Okay, without any further ado then, it is my pleasure to invite Jessica to take over control of this proceeding. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. So I lead work on nature at the UNEP Finance Initiative. So we have a membership platform with hundreds of banks and insurers, and we have a partnership with the Principles for Responsible Investment to access the thousands of investors in their network. So I'm going to be opening this topic really from a finance point of view. And if we can go to the next slide, I just want to try to drill home the message of nature is providing solutions to climate, but we need to act now or else we're losing them. So a few years ago, the IMF put out a report and it quantified the value of every single whale to carbon sequestration and valued each at around 2 million. Now we've lost around 4/5 of the whale population. Many species of whales are extinct. Certain species that, like the blue whale, that are great at sequestering carbon, are down to about 3% of the original population. So, the question is, if we'd not had the whaling industry, if we'd, saved the whales as the hippies asked us to do in the 1970s, would we even have a carbon climate problem today to speak of? So, it's just an illustration that, potentially there are solutions out there that we haven't fully grasped. And, when we look at the topic of net zero, it is a ledger where you have sequestration from different, emitting industries, you have emissions, and then you have sequestration, and much of that sequestration is coming from nature now. So, we're really undermining our solutions and really undermining everything else that we're trying to do to cut emissions by losing nature today, which is out there providing solutions. Now, if we can go to the next slide, I just wanted to illustrate a little bit of the carbon storage potential of different ecosystems. And you'll see here on the right that soil is a great asset. And we also have plant and animal life, which is a great asset as well, that I illustrated with the whales. Now, we are hoping to update this graphic in the year ahead. This comes from Carbon Streaming and Visual Capitalist to make sure that marine environments are really well reflected as well, because the science is coming out that they've been really underappreciated in terms of their carbon sequestration potential. For example, mangroves and seagrasses. So, when we are looking at this topic, I'm thinking more about the mitigation angle, but nature gives us a lot of solutions also in terms of adaptation and resilience building that also provide benefits for communities. For example, 1 billion people rely on coral reefs. Around 1.6 billion people rely on forests. So there are opportunities out there for nature-based solutions that have been called good news stories from both, climate, nature, and sustainable development angles. Now, UNEP has an effort, if we can go on to the next slide, to actually quantify the state of finance for nature-based solutions. And this was originally released last year. And the current capital flows towards nature-based solutions were quantified at 152 billion per year. And this is, a small proportion of the finance that is going towards climate overall. And these figures are being updated over the year. They will be updated, shortly in the coming weeks. But if we go on to the next slide, what I wanted to highlight is really the positive financial flows towards nature-based solutions and climate finance more generally are really dwarfed by, the financial flows towards negative, harmful activities, subsidies that are really undermining our natural capital. So the positive finance going towards nature really needs to increase by 4 to 8 times every year for us as a planet to meet our climate goals, our nature goals, and our sustainable development goals. Now, I'm going to show you a bit of a preview, and UNEP, as I mentioned, is about to re-release the State of Finance for Nature. It's been moved on to a hub, and it's going to get more granular over time, so you would be able to explore the data. But this is a preview basically of, if finance is brought forward for nature, it could help to really abate over 10 gigatons of CO2 in our atmosphere. So there's science behind, if we invest in nature, it will give us returns. Now, as I mentioned, we work with banks, insurers, investors, and over 500 of them have made commitments to achieving net zero. And many of you in the audience, will have, through your companies, made commitments to net zero as well. Now, the discussion around net zero so far faced such a lot of interest on the emissions side of our ledger and not on the sequestration side. And in some industries, this can make sense. But when we are moving towards looking at scope 3 emissions and thinking about our food system, for example, that's one where it really doesn't make sense to separate these topics. And we really need to be working hand in hand between nature and climate. So if we can go on to the next slide. The Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership recently released this report, which really gives that rationale for integrated climate nature approaches, which I encourage everybody to read. But we are hearing more and more from financial institutions that they're asking their clients to not only set net zero science-based targets, but also science-based targets for nature. So I think amongst the audience, you are going to, be hearing this more and more from the financial institutions that are financing your activities. And many people coming to this topic come from the climate side, and around the world, a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon anywhere in the world. It's a really clear, easy metric. But when we're trying to value nature and biodiversity, nature has different values at a global level, a national level, a local level. And we are seeing studies come out that are showing that Indigenous peoples and local communities have been actually doing better at managing biodiversity resources in the territories that they manage and steward, even more so than the institutions that governments have set up to manage biodiversity, for example, through protected areas. So IPLCs, this acronym you might see, Indigenous peoples and local communities, are being recognized as important stewards of nature and biodiversity, also of irrecoverable carbon. However, very few climate or nature finance transactions actually take place in IPLC's managed areas. And a study came out of showing that less than 1% of climate finance reaches IPLCs, and the proportion we're trying to quantify at the moment, shows it's much, much less for nature finance as well. So it's very important to consider who is actually at the front line of managing nature and biodiversity when we think about investing in it. And similarly, if we go on to the next slide, you will have heard the term just transition in relation to climate change. There is also a call for just nature transition and working on these topics much more closely together in terms of climate, nature, and finance. So going on, we have a very big year in the nature space. Many of you will be aware that it's the second half of the 15th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Some are calling it a Paris moment. We hope it's a Paris moment, not a Copenhagen moment, for nature. And there is a draft global biodiversity framework, which calls for no net loss of nature from 2020, which is obviously, 2020 has passed, net positive by 2030, and full recovery, so living in harmony with nature by 2050. Now, the framework has been in development, and if we can go on to the next slide, you will see parallels to the Paris Agreement here as well. So goal D in the draft framework is a call for the alignment of all financial flows with these goals of halting and reversing nature loss. So that is, if you're familiar with the Paris Agreement language, it's the 2.1C equivalent. And there's also specific targets in the draft which are targeting finance and removal of negative subsidies and would require, for example, the assessment and disclosure of impacts and dependencies on nature by finance and business. So this is effectively bringing the recommendations of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which are, the framework is in beta at the moment, into policy and regulation across the 190 plus parties to the convention. There's also a target around repurposing harmful subsidies, so negative flows redirected into positive, and mobilizing new financial resources from all sources, including corporate and private finance. Now, if anybody's following and engaged in the UN processes, you will have seen that the UN Environment Assembly earlier this year came to an agreement on the definition of nature-based solutions. So in the UN landscape, this is something that actually supersedes both the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it calls for action on nature-based solutions, including public and private finance. So in our role at UNEP, we manage industry platforms. So we run the Principles for Responsible Banking, the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, and with PRI, the Investment Leadership Program. If we can go on to the next slide. So this is an important topic for our members to be very aware of, and we have a number of initiatives underway, including piloting of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures beta framework. And, UNEP really encourages industry leadership, but we also increasingly work with regulators, financial supervisors, central banks on sort of baking in the leadership into policy and regulation. So we're seeing a lot of dynamic between interest from financial regulators in this topic, and some of you will have seen the NGFS publish an occasional paper on biodiversity risk which is really driving home the importance of this topic to systemic financial risk. So if we go on to the next slide, how UNEP is supporting our members, we have a biodiversity community in the Principles for Responsible Banking. PRB banks are setting biodiversity targets. Many of the banks who signed the Principles for Responsible Banking did so 3 years ago, so their targets are due in the year ahead. So you'll see more activity from banks in terms of biodiversity target setting. Within the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, I've just shifted over from a platform, or sorry, a panel within our global roundtable with the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, speaking about nature positive insurance and the activities that are happening both in a voluntary space in the year ahead, but also, interest from regulators on this topic. And then within the investment leadership program, we have been working on data, metrics, and stewardship, and we will be increasing the level of thought leadership on this topic in the year ahead as the framework is hopefully agreed at the end of this year. We also provide tools and guidance. Some of you may be familiar with the Encore tool. So that's a tool for exploring natural capital risk opportunities and exposure. We each year promote the new nature finance that's come to market. So promoting market leadership. And we have showcases on ocean finance and sustainable food finance. And we are very happy that the government of Germany is going to be supporting us to create another year-long learning journey on nature-based solutions investing for our members next year. So all in sum, what I wanted to say is that nature-based solutions finance is really a good news story in the sense of it's a way to meet climate, nature, and sustainable development goals. It also supports financial institutions in meeting their own net zero commitments, which relies on many of you in the audience as their clients. It is very much an emerging asset class at the frontier, but is moving from Earth Shots to bankable. So some of you may know the CEO of the Earth Shots Prize. She said this is the space right now around nature is very much the Series A, to be investing in. It does require more risk takers to scale nature-based finance, both from the public and the private side. But IUCN and the Coalition for Private Investment and Conservation recently had a panel in New York Climate Week, which said, we can really already do more with traditional financial instruments in this space. From our financial institutions, we're hearing a lot of demand for capacity building, peer exchange, guidance, and tools. And, from their perspective, this is a really pre-competitive space. And then finally, as I mentioned, we need to be just very much aware of the context of nature and social risks and opportunities when looking at nature and how this is different from carbon. Finally, I wanted to mention that with the Green Finance Institute, UNEP has been releasing a 5-part special podcast series that I'm very happy to co-host with Helen Avery of the Green Finance Institute, where each week in the lead up to COP, Helen's interviewing someone in a leadership space and I'm interviewing someone in a practical project or asset manager role around what nature-based solutions means and how we can scale finance for nature-based solutions. So I will leave it there. I am extremely happy to be joined in this panel with two wonderful experts with great experience in this topic. So Greta Talbot-Jones is with us from Aviva Investors and Cécile Girardin from the University of Oxford. So if I can just ask, yes, Greta and Cécile, have you got your cameras on? Fantastic. So Cécile, I have introduced this topic from the perspective of a financial institution and, our work with financial members. You're really working on this from a scientific and technical perspective. So, there's many developments in this space from all angles. What do you see coming ahead that will help corporates, finance, and other stakeholders really act on nature-based solutions? And maybe it might be actually good if we can start with you to, maybe give us a more granular definition of nature-based solutions, because I've kind of given, some selected examples, but do you want to sort of ground us a little bit more in the definition?
Thanks, Jessica. Thank you for the invitations. It's fantastic to be here. I think you did a brilliant job in introducing nature-based solutions and financing around nature-based solutions and some of the issues we're encountering fast as the movement has been growing very, very fast over the past few years. More specifically, I think you pointed to the UNEA 5.2 resolution, which is very recent and took a lot of effort to get to an agreement on deciding a universal definition of what nature-based solutions is. But in a nutshell, we always say it involves nature-based solutions, involve working with nature to address societal challenges, to provide benefits for both human well-being and biodiversity, and as well as the climate and the climate mitigation benefits that we talk about a lot, and there's been a huge focus on these climate mitigation benefits. So I think we'll talk about that a bit later in our fireside chat. But in practice, we're really talking about projects to protect ecosystems, all ecosystems, be it forest, wetlands, grasslands, savannas, marine ecosystems, as you were demonstrating, to manage working lands, so to improve the sustainability management of our agricultural lands, and to restore ecosystems. So those are the three main pathways that we're talking about when we talk about nature-based solutions. And I can go into that in more detail later on. I think you were asking me about what the challenges are in this space.
Yes, and what do we have in the year ahead that's going to help actors to address those challenges?
Okay. So, well, maybe I'll just start by saying that I work for Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, which is a research institution at the University of Oxford. And more recently, we've spun out a social venture called Nature-Based Insetting that helps companies implement nature-based solutions, mainly along their supply chains at the moment. So we're working at the interface between research and practice to help companies understand and mitigate their biodiversity impacts and risks and dependencies. And in doing so, improve the resilience of their natural capital assets that they depend on. So by taking the research into practice, I'm really at the forefront of the technical challenges we're facing here. How do we get practical solutions that adjust to the very basic problems of traceability that we keep on facing, supply chain traceability, but that also have the ecological and social integrity that we need to implement nature-based solutions in a way that will deliver, basically that deliver effective, durable, scalable benefits that promote societal well-being, as well as being economically viable and ecologically viable. So it's a tall ask, but there are, in terms of the challenges ahead and what's coming, we have, I think, taking a step back, there have been a lot of great announcements first recently. So in 2021, we had the G7 backing the introduction of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which you already mentioned. And this comes after the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. I think this is a great movement, a great consortium that's going to help build consensus on what's needed in this space. And these are reporting requirements that were established to provide risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on their nature-related risks and opportunities. But also in COP26, I'm shooting ahead here. In COP26, there were a lot of big nature-related announcements that were made. So around the core business of the negotiations, there were announcements that were made with a strong focus on halting deforestation and shifting to more sustainable farming practices. So that included the Glasgow Leaders Forest Declaration, for example, where more than 100 countries are committing to end deforestation by 2030. or the financial sector roadmap for eliminating commodity-driven deforestation was also released at COP26. And all in all, commitments for public and private sector amounted to approximately $19 billion for nature and land use, which, as you pointed out, is very small proportion of climate finance. So we need more of that flow of investment to go towards nature, positive results. And that's part of what the TNFD and the science-based targets for nature, which you also mentioned, are working towards shifting this flow of finance from projects that are damaging to climate, nature, and human well-being towards projects that are beneficial. Net positive is always referred to. But then, so all this is demonstrating that the private sector are increasingly engaged in supporting biodiversity as well as keeping below 1.5. But the barriers are now this lack of consensus on the mechanisms needed to ensure that there's accountability, traceability, transparency in all these projects, and how these commitments will be implemented, how they'll be monitored and regulated in a socially just context. So again, repeating what you said, but it's important to hammer it in that we really want a just transition, not just a transition. Mm-hmm. And so that was said a lot at COP26 too. And yeah, I think I'll probably stop there. I think if you want to dive even more into the technical side, which is what I'm working on, we can, but there's still a lack of consensus on how to monitor and measure impacts on biodiversity. So that's a whole other bubbling pot of interest.
Great, Cécile. Well, I think we're going to probably hear some questions from the audience. So in this boiling pot of interest, maybe we can just see from the audience which aspects of that pot they want to get into. But I'll go next to Greta. Now, Greta, you're really working at the front line of project development in this space, and it's wonderful that we can have you on the panel, because I think this is a great contrast in perspectives. What do you really see as the barriers to scaling up finance for nature-based solutions? And then what are you seeing around you that's opening this up?
Yeah. So I think firstly, I want to frame it and just remind everyone I'm coming here as an institutional investor, which we're a new party to this game. And I think the reason I personally took this role is to kind of accelerate the amount of capital that's going into kind of nature-focused projects. We've got $35 trillion in pension funds around the world. And what we need to do is basically de-risk nature-based solutions so we can get some of those large pots of money flowing into these projects. So how do we do that? So I think the first thing is around de-risking. One of the people often say nature-based solutions are kind of parallel to or similar to where solar and wind were kind of 15, 20 years ago, where you couldn't compare projects, there was no benchmarking, data was really hard to come by, there was a lot of operational risk associated with it, and a lot of that actually came from misunderstanding, or not misunderstanding, but a lack of understanding. So I think the first real barrier is kind of that de-risking, and that will come through benchmarking, data availability. But nature-based solutions is more complicated than that because every project has its nuances. So I think these methodologies of how we kind of calculate the benefits of this, and some people are very against putting a number on nature, but I think working in a financial institution, it's definitely a really powerful way to kind of mobilize capital into the space. So I think that first piece around kind of de-risking, and that'll come through data, benchmarking, and kind of ratings, as much as they can be destructive sometimes, I think it is really important. The second is, I suppose, on the asset owner side. Investment horizons for nature-based solutions are long. I work in real assets, so this is liquid, so we do infrastructure and built environment investing. Long-term investment horizons aren't unheard of course, but this is different. Cash flows often are pushed to the back end of project life cycles. And so I think that second challenge is, how do we create products and funds that give investors sufficient liquidity to move in and out of funds, but at the same time acknowledge that these are long-term projects. And if they really are backing net zero targets or biodiversity targets when they do come through, they need to be prepared to kind of take that long-term view. So I think that kind of investment horizon and how people invest is a barrier at the moment. We see it shifting, but I still think there's work that needs to be done there. And I think the third piece is on the policy side. So we need really stable policy. We need policy at the multilateral perspective, which we are seeing, but we also need policy at the domestic and local authority level. So I think through the whole kind of policy chain there, we need to see consistent policies in place. We do see some great grant funding initiatives, especially in the UK. I'm based in the UK, we're UK investors, we're pan-European investors. So there are great initiatives there. And I think until the carbon price kind of jumps up on the voluntary side, to make these projects break even without those kind of policy support, stability in that area is really important to basically make sure that we can de-risk it. It's all about de-risking at the moment. And I think finally, I'm jumping in and saying too much, but it's around a big piece. There's always opposition to land use change. So that's kind of bridging on the social side. And I think that's something we're very conscious of as an institutional investor, especially in the UK. There's been a lot of kind of negative press around traditional institutions being involved in nature. And I think we're very used to the rolling hills of the UK countryside and the concept of them being covered with trees or restored to potentially what their natural ecosystem state is, to some people seems quite shocking. So I think that kind of negotiation around how we change the land use, and especially in areas where they potentially don't get great yields from agriculture, how then do we make sure that all parties benefit from this, and we're not kind of dislocating people from the land that they've lived on all around for kind of hundreds of years. So as an institutional investor, that franchise risk and making sure that we manage that is really important.
Thank you. And Greta, I didn't mention this before when we spoke earlier, but I actually have my own pension in Aviva in the UK, so it gives me a lot of confidence to speak with you and hear about your work. Now, Cécile, as we're seeing more and more finance come to nature, and as we mentioned, it's still not enough, but are the projects that are coming to bear, are they hitting the right point of impact? What do you think about the projects that have happened so far? Are you confident about this market or worried?
Both. I think there have been a lot of great projects. We have identified well, there's a big incentive to identify good projects at the moment. There's still I think the consensus is there's a lack of good projects, the good examples. There's more finance available than projects available. But we have, there are lots of organizations out there looking at assessing projects from around the world to find hundreds of projects that adhere to the IUCN guidelines, for example. And I would always refer to the IUCN guidelines for nature-based solutions, or the high-level principles of nature-based solutions. And these includes protection, management, restoration projects from all over the world, all types of ecosystems. The Nature-Based Solutions Initiative has a great global interactive map where you can search projects from all over the world, and these have been carefully assessed to make sure they do hit all the right notes, as you're saying, I think, Jessica. But there is also a great concern, because as companies have been setting their net zero goals, they've been looking to nature-based solutions for climate mitigation increasingly. And this is where there's a big pitfall and a big concern. And if I may, I'd love to share a slide. I always find it easier. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the contribution of, and you started talking about this, Jessica, in your presentation. I saw you had some values on this, and a couple of years ago, we got together with experts from around the world and tried to figure out what the contribution of nature-based solutions for mitigating climate change in terms that are relevant to the Paris Agreement are. So we're aiming for net zero, we're aiming for 1.5 by mid-century, and how much do nature-based solutions contribute to that? It's an important question to answer as companies are looking to nature-based solutions to reach their net zero target, really. And so we, based on a famous model by Bronson, Griscom and team from 2017 that was updated, we're looking at 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year saved by deploying nature-based solutions at scale globally, starting now, like let's get going immediately. And so this is 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. It's really focusing on carbon dioxide. So when we put in the other greenhouse gases, we get to the estimates vary between 11 gigatons of CO2 equivalent to 14 gigatons per year. And that's the equivalent of maybe the transport sector or the agricultural sector, but not transport plus agriculture plus construction plus everything we're trying to get nature to do at the moment. So it's putting it in perspective a bit. And let's if you look at this diagram, you can see that half of this comes from avoided emissions. So that's not removing carbons from the atmosphere, that is avoiding emissions. So we absolutely have to avoid these emissions. We have to protect forests, grasslands, get to zero deforestation, protect grasslands, wetlands, mangroves, etc., to ensure that we're not continually emitting greenhouse gases from these huge long-term stores that are very resilient, because intact ecosystems, biodiverse ecosystems will be more resilient to climate change. And so that's half of the avoided emissions. And some of it also comes from avoiding emissions from working land and agriculture. And the other half is enhanced sinks. So that's where we're looking at offsets. So that's brings us down to 5 gigatons CO2 per year that we can rely on to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And most of this comes, as you can see from this diagram, comes from better management of working land. So this is land that we're already using. We don't need to more land for this. It's land that we're already using, and we can change our agricultural practices to more sustainable practices that are more aligned with our net zero goals. Mm-hmm. And then only 20% of this whole total comes from restoring ecosystems. And that's where the huge interest in tree planting and restoring forests is fantastic for many reasons, but not necessarily for purely carbon benefits for getting to our net zero target. Reason. So it's good to put it in people's mind that we're looking at these different pathways for mitigating climate change. And if you look at, I won't go on about this, but if you look at the figure in the bottom right, you can see that in terms of getting to reducing our 1.5 emissions, so getting to below 1.5 global warming, that would happen. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yes, okay. That would happen by mid-century. We'd get to a scenario where we're peaking global warming at 1.5. So these are the IPCC scenarios. And if you add nature-based solutions, as described here, to this scenario, we'd get to reducing our emissions, reducing our warming by 0.1 degrees C by mid-century. So that's the contribution in terms that are relevant to the Paris Agreement. And later on in the century, we would get to reducing by 0.3 degrees C, because there's more time for these solutions to act. And that's a very important point. These solutions are time dependent. So the more they have time to act, the more they will continue creating this cooling effect to our planet. And by the end of the century, we will get many benefits, climate benefits from these ecosystems. But in order to get this, we need to have systems that are ecologically sound. So biodiversity is a key component of this. Healthy ecosystems that are complex, biodiverse, and that will be able to be resilient in the face of a changing climate.
Absolutely. And I think many of us remember this study a couple of years ago, which said, 37% of our solutions to the Paris Agreement could come from nature, but we need to act now. And the decline of that number over time. So it really does also, with the example of the whale I gave, it does really emphasize the need to act quickly. And, I also would have, encouraged all of our participants to look at the Living Planet Index and report that's come out today, because that has a big picture of what's happening with wildlife and our ecosystems, but it also gives more of a granular picture. So we really need to situate ourselves there to really understand what are nature-based opportunities in different locations.
Can I just add, Jessica, sorry to correct there, but this concept of 30% of the solution comes from nature. It's so the people behind the study is Bronson et al. This is the same model we're working on, and that is the values are correct, etc. It's just that I think this whole thing has been slightly misinterpreted as 30% of the solution. Nature does not present 30% of the solution. They do provide about 30% of global emissions, maybe, but it's more useful to look at it in terms of how much they contribute in terms of avoided warming.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think that's a very important point, so thanks for raising it. Now, I'm coming back to you, Greta. Sorry, we have a lot more consistency coming now. The science-based targets for nature are out for public consultation right now. I think the consideration around scope 3 emissions on the climate side, we're getting more consistency in metrics, we're getting more data coming online. What does this mean? What does this really unlock for you as a project developer in terms of the opportunities for financing nature-based solutions?
So I think all these kind of, I suppose, quite like high, well, they're not high level, but like they're quite universal kind of policy arrangements. One really good thing is they educate investors, they educate corporates, and they force them to think about this, right? It's unavoidable. When you have to disclose on this, you have to think about it, and you don't want to go in the wrong direction. You want to be having a positive impact. So I think in a very simplistic way, I think like global biodiversity targets also, they enable a uniform set of goals that people can kind of align their portfolios with. I think SDGs have done that really well on the social side. And I think now that there's a lot bigger appetite for biodiversity to come to the forefront, I think we're going to see them used like that a lot more, which is a positive thing. So I think it creates demand, right? Because it creates demand for projects, it creates demand for funds and products which allow people to invest in this stuff, whether it's directly or indirectly. But I also think on the policy side, we're seeing more domestic policy like biodiversity net gain in the UK come through, which actually has a huge impact on the creation of projects. Like no initiative like this is perfect, right? And there's always going to be critiques of this and say it's not measured correctly. There's going to be subjectivity in how you measure this. But fundamentally, this means that every development in the UK from the end of next year, even if it's not made into law, local authorities have picked up on this and they're running with it. So it's going to be required full consents. And I think that's a really powerful example of why kind of that lower level policy is really important. It means that ecological assessments are going to become common practice on any new development site, which doesn't happen to the extent that it should at the moment. A whole new market for biodiversity units is created. So it causes investors to basically consider the price of nature from the outset, which is really powerful. They're saying that there could be £135 million worth of demand for biodiversity units every year, Whether that eventuates, who knows? But I think in principle, it's a great example of, at a domestic level, kind of biodiversity, the investment in biodiversity being very measurable and quantifiable, right? And I think with anything in the ESG space, whether it's carbon, biodiversity, nature, measurement, and that data side, and be able to kind of like prove that additionality is really important from a credibility perspective. So I think the high level disclosure requirements are really important to generate, I suppose, the interest and demand for kind of those direct investments on the ground. So they work in collaboration. But yeah, I think we're going to see a lot. There's also massive data issues with this, right? Is every institution, company who's had to go through the kind of disclosure side on the emissions are probably looking at the nature one and going, oh gosh, where do we go here? So I think it's going to be a learning, it's going to be a learning, and people have to be flexible. They need to understand that it's never going to be perfect the first time round, but what it does, it opens people's eyes up to what we need to do. So I think that's a really positive thing.
Great. Yeah. So, you know, at UNEP, we work a lot at this global, you know, what we call normative level, but it really needs, you know, a lot of things really need to be translated to a region, a country, a local area, you know, to really have impact. So no, but absolutely having that sort of global signals and norms, you know, sort of moves the industry along, and regulators, and gives them confidence, you know, to act if many of them are acting together. Great. So Cécile, you know, you've been so engaged in the science around this process. You know, the value of nature, the economic value of nature, and the case making for investing in nature. Now, you know, we're in a situation of volatility and probably increased volatility. I think, you know, many will have seen Jamie Dimon recently suggesting that the US is 6 to 9 months from a recession. There's obviously a war in the Ukraine. We have really high food prices and energy prices. So investors are looking for safe places to put their money. Now, you know, we do promote nature-based solutions as a good news story. How does this relate to, you know, the volatility that we see in the world? Why, you know, amongst everything, should investors be putting their money in nature, and, you know, corporates on the line, you know, putting their own capital behind nature?
Thanks, Jessica. I think, well, more than ever, we need to be investing in nature to improve the resilience of this life support systems that we depend on. Well, first, I wanted to just acknowledge that I really agree with what Greta was saying, that monitoring biodiversity is complex, and the work that's being done, especially around the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, is very important in terms of gathering a global momentum for consensus around this, and the complexities of it are there, and we shouldn't shy away from the complexities of biodiversity. On the contrary, that's what makes life so interesting. And we're working on a pilot with TNFD exploring all this, so I'm very happy to be doing that. But to answer your question, Jessica, there have been a series of publications over the past few years that really make the business case for investing in nature. You may have come across the Dasgupta review or many World Economic Forum risk reports, and most conclude that, or demonstrate that, natural capital is the single most important input to our global economy, and that investing in the protection, restoration, and better management of ecosystems, including agricultural lands, of course, makes economic sense for businesses. And a lot of businesses rely on natural capital, as we know. So you may have come across the Dasgupta review in 2021 that made a great case for this, or the annual risk reports from World Economic Forum that say, that clearly demonstrate that climate and biodiversity are the two greatest risks to our global economy. And what we do need is more, well, again, to get to linked to the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, we need to be able to quantify businesses' dependencies on nature. So we need more information on exactly how we quantify these dependencies on nature to make the case for investing in nature. And we need more evidence on the cost of inaction in nature. So lots of work is going on this, on what not acting on nature would cost the economy. But all in all, there's so much evidence that shows that complex landscapes are biodiverse landscapes, and that biodiverse landscapes are more resilient to the rapid climate change that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. And Greta, when Aviva is communicating about nature, is this cost of inaction part of the messaging? Is it, can you communicate about it from, a concern of pension holders, for their footprint on the world? Or, how can this really be explained in a way that, someone who's concerned about their retirement could really understand?
Yeah, so a few things on this. I think, to my point earlier, that these are really long-term investments, right? So in terms of a crisis that we're going through at the moment, which is horrible, like obviously cost of living crisis in the UK, like globally, there's huge instability. But the investment horizons we're talking about are 15, 20 years often. So you see the economy go in cycles, right? So if you're really serious about seeing the benefits of investing in biodiversity and nature, it's a long-term investment. So you will see the benefits at the back end of any crisis that you're going through. I think obviously in the UK, there's a specific issue at the moment around kind of the requirement for liquidity. So I think that's a concern in terms of whether it will change asset owners' perception of what they want their exposure to real assets for long-term investments to be in the future. I think that there is evidence and there's research to show that exposure to kind of carbon can mitigate the climate impacts of portfolio returns. I think that if we commit to the belief that the carbon price will go up over time, there is that kind of favorable unknown uplift that you can get on returns of projects. I also think just fundamentally, we have a social obligation to do so. Right, I think that there are so many co-benefits of nature-based solutions around flood mitigation, temperature regulation of the built environment, reducing physical climate risk, right? Being real assets investors and having a big portfolio of infrastructure projects and buildings and things, it makes sense to kind of invest in nature to reduce those kind of physical climate impacts. So I think quite often when you speak to people in isolation about an asset class, it's quite hard to then get them thinking in more a system-focused way. But yeah, aside from the very clear social obligation to do this, I think the investment case, the research is building up to show that this will pay off. And then I also think that these are long-term investments, so they will see out multiple kind of economic up times and downturns, and that shouldn't mean that we can just abstain from investing in the space for a period of time.
Great, thank you. And Cécile, tomorrow we have a panel at our UNEP Global Roundtable, and one of our banks is doing an initiative with some of their clients to put filters to avoid microplastics from washing machines getting into aquatic ecosystems. And we're featuring this on a panel about nature-based solutions. Even though we had a little debate, is this a nature-based solution or is this just a good thing to do, which has some knock-on for nature. So how I know you showed the slide previously, but if for those in the audience who are thinking about we had 44% say yes, we're investing in nature, can we give a more granular idea of what is a nature-based solution, and why wouldn't the microplastics example sort of fall within that definition?
Yeah, exactly, Jessica. There are a lot of great projects out there that are sustainable projects. There are also a sustainable development that achieve sustainable development goal, sustainable agriculture, etc. But in order to be a nature-based solutions, projects need to align to the IUCN global standards and the 4 high-level nature-based solutions guidelines, which are good for biodiversity. So they need to demonstrate measurable benefits to biodiversity, to human well-being, and then also, well, one of the first principle is do not delay decarbonization, so not as an alternative to rapid decarbonization, and be implemented with the full participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. These projects will not, they need to have societal benefits also, and increase socioeconomic resilience of local communities, etc. They will not be long-term projects if they're not implemented with the full participation of the stewards of these landscapes, as you both have said already. But this is something we really need to reiterate, and there's a lack of understanding how to measure that and how to monitor positive impacts on this, so we need to continue working on that. But yeah, in general, nature-based solutions adhere to IUCN global standards, and that's a really good anchor for these projects.
Great, yes. And just in terms of the questions from the audience, Greta, we have someone who's dropped their email in and would love to follow up with you. And Cécile, I think there's encouragement around the topic of, you know, the cost of inaction and making sure that we have the social context, you know, involved in our definition of nature-based solutions, which I agree with as well. Now, we are expecting IUCN to also have a definition of nature positive. Now, nature positive is sort of coming alongside net zero in our vocabulary. Cécile, what do you think the definition of nature positive is going to do to the investor landscape around nature-based solutions?
Okay, that's a really tough question. I think this is a debate that's really going on at the moment, and I don't know if anyone can answer this, but from what I've gathered from discussions I've been in, that there is a bit of a backlash when it comes to nature and biodiversity on the concept of net, because how can you offset biodiversity when it's so location specific? One intact ecosystem in one location is not the equivalent of a restored ecosystem in another location. So there's a lot of contention around the term net when it comes to biodiversity. That in my understanding, this is why we're moving towards nature positive, and nature positive seems to be more encompassing of everything that we're trying to do in this space. The exact definitions I'm looking forward to seeing myself.
Yeah. And we see more interest in the topic of biodiversity credits, and sometimes there's a confusion between credits and offsets, and you know, offsets certainly need to come at the very, very end of, you know, a mitigation hierarchy. Is there more that you can say about this market around nature that's emerging, and the idea of credits, and you know, from your scientific and technical point of view?
So I haven't been involved specifically in this piece of research, but I know there is research coming out that will clarify the pitfalls of looking at biodiversity in terms of credits, and also you're saying this is different to offsets, but in terms of credits and assigning a value as credits to biodiversity. I think in the end we'll get a mixture of options for financing nature-based solutions. And more recently, I've been looking towards the risk financing from risk. That seems to be a very important part of the piece of the puzzle. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of research coming up on this and how we actually finance. It feels like this is the next big stage, green finance, how we're transferring finance towards nature-based solutions internally within companies or globally, adjusting targets, etc. is a interesting area of research.
Great. And I saw Greta, you nodding to Cécile's comment. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd love to hear if you have any comment on this. We also have a question from the audience about your thoughts on ocean-based solutions. And I'll give you a minute to think about the offset credit question, Greta, but I also wanted to mention that we have at UNEP, we host the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Initiative, and there is a set of principles for investing in the blue economy. And sectoral guidance, for example, for ports or coastal infrastructure, and also guidance and recommended exclusions around, activities, economic activities that could harm our, marine and coastal ecosystems, including deep sea mining and dredging. So I encourage anybody to take a look at that guidance, which has been, quite a large process to develop it. Great. So Greta, would you like to comment on the credits?
On the biodiversity unit thing. Yeah. So I think so there's always such discussion around putting a price on nature, right? It's one of those, it's the classic one that's been around for decades of should you put a price on nature, and how do you value that? And then the estimates that you get have such a wild spread depending on what you look at, right? I do think that sitting on the other side where you're talking to investors, well, like asset owners, and you want a way to communicate this, I think it's one of you become stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? As you want to mobilize capital into the space, but people like a way to measure things. And I think that it's biodiversity net gains a perfect one, right? They're trying to create biodiversity units and they've created a way to measure that, but there's a subjectivity associated with it. I think this will evolve. This is cut one of this, and I think we will see so many evolutions of it as we've done with carbon credits, right? If you look at how carbon credits were produced in the 90s, the scrutiny with which you produce them now is completely different, and how you verify them and what value is associated with them and the credibility associated with some projects versus others. I think biodiversity will go through that same kind of evolution. And I think that there will be a constant debate about whether we should be putting a price on these units or not. But I think it will mobilize overall more investment into the space as a result of it. So it's one of those things which maybe is a necessary evil, but it depends who you talk to and how you look at it.
Great. Well, thank you for that view. And we have a good question with quite a lot of upvotes on the Q&A. And Cécile, if I can ask you, for our question is from Aaron Sharp, how important are carbon offsetting and or carbon credits for financing NBS?
So they're a big portion of financing the natural climate solutions. Another term to throw in there. So natural climate solutions at the moment are defined as a subset of nature-based solutions with a strong focus on climate benefits, so benefits for carbon gains. And the way they differ from nature-based solutions is that their requirements for demonstrating measurable benefits to biodiversity are somehow lowered, hence lower the cost of actually implementing the project. So there is a huge flow of finance towards natural climate solutions for carbon benefits. I guess that was a question. Yes, there is. And we just need to, again, as I was demonstrating when you looked at the figure, we just need to bear in mind the potential for these projects to actually get us to our net zero target, to make sure, as Greta says, that there are different levels of rigorousness in these projects. We really need to ensure that when there is a role for nature-based solutions in climate mitigation, but we need to ensure that these projects are adhering to the highest standards of verification. There's the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative to guide us on that, and to make sure they also adhere to the principles of doing no harm to biodiversity, or enhancing human well-being, and preferably not only do no harm, but actually enhance biodiversity and enhance human well-being. Because if we're investing in projects now that do not support biodiversity, they won't give you the long-term storage carbon benefits that you're investing in.
And I think you're touching as well a little bit on a question that came through from Isabella Viacelli. And she asked, what is the difference between financing nature-based solutions versus purchasing removal carbon credits in order to mitigate the carbon emissions of a company? So I think you've outlined that a little bit, but maybe you could just give us another 30 seconds to make that crystal clear.
So just to make it crystal clear, nature-based solutions adhere to the IUCN guidelines, and that means providing measurable benefits for biodiversity, human well-being, as well as climate mitigation. Carbon credits will have a strong focus on carbon gains, carbon benefits, and do not necessarily need you to demonstrate measurable benefits for biodiversity.
I think also, just to build on that, I think there is there's potentially a responsibility for companies to actually be developing these projects. And I think purely buying offsets in the long term, quite a few people have to do it in the short term because they're figuring out how to develop these projects, right? But I think in the long term, there's a responsibility to directly finance these projects. And I think blindly buying offsets without kind of looking at how you can project finance or invest in projects and develop them will kind of become a concept of like part of kind of greenwashing in the future, right? If you're not showing to kind of take those extra steps to figure out how you can properly invest in this space, an easy way out is buying offsets without tracking the credibility of those. So I think there are ways to do this which are ethical, and there are ways to do this which are not.
Yes.
And I think, as you say, Greta, is seen as greenwashing now, not even in the future, but it is greenwashing now.
Yeah.
And,
I don't want to be too harsh, but
yeah.
Sometimes it's necessary though, if in the short term, right? I think we've got to acknowledge that developing these projects does take a while. So there is a reason why people are offsetting now, but I do think you can't blindly offset into the future.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a great point to end on. I'm just going to summarize. You know, we have many corporates in the real economy in the audience. They should be getting ready by setting science-based targets for nature. They need to be getting familiar with the IUCN guidelines around nature-based solutions, making sure that the targets that they set, the impact that they're going towards is credible, and they need to be taking risks and be patient in this landscape. Now, we're coming to the end of our time that we have for this panel. I really want to thank Greta and Cécile, and if I can bring back Steve to move us on. I think that this has been a wonderful tour and having a great perspective from the kind of normative finance landscape, a project developer in the finance landscape, and the scientific and technical perspective. And we hope that the colleagues in the audience are more and more familiar with this topic and ready to continue diving in and making sure that the investments that we make are contributing to climate, nature, and sustainable development goals.
I'm going to echo that and say a huge thank you to you, Jessica, and Greta and Cécile, for letting us listen in on this really interesting conversation. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience has as well. So thank you very, very much for giving us your time and wisdom today. This is the end of the 7th session, the penultimate session in our Climate Action Summit. Coming up next, the final, the great debate, nature versus technology. We've got a fantastic group, 2 teams of 3 will be facing off starts at 3:15, so in just half an hour. Big thank you to Foresight Group, who are hosting us in person at their offices in the Shard. And the debate is going to be moderated by a Foresight Group partner, Dan Wells. I'm not going to list all the names of our debaters in the interest of time, but experts and feisty debaters. It should be a lot of fun, as well as being really entertaining. So I strongly encourage you to join us for that session in just 30 minutes from now. Let's go on to our last slide. And just again, a reminder, next week is the third session in our Social Mobility, Improving Business and Society webinar series. And I really want to draw your attention to Measuring Up 2.0, which is a really huge report that we published last week, taking stock of the UK's performance towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Specific to today's events, there's lots of deep analysis in that report on the UK's progress or lack of progress around strengthening biodiversity, conserving nature, and taking action on climate. So I really urge you to have a look at that resource as something that could inform your own work. Finally, if you're not following us already on Twitter and LinkedIn, please do so. It's a great way to stay in touch with us and all of the programming that we offer. Over 100 events a year, lots of great content to support business in being more sustainable. When this session ends, a survey will pop up. It'll just take you a couple of minutes to fill it out, but your feedback is really valuable to help us improve our programming going forward. And that's all. So again, thanks very much to our speakers. Thank you to our audience for being so engaged. Have a great rest of the day if we're not going to see you in 30 minutes at the debate, but I certainly hope that we will do. Thank you.